She was rejected with a smile, told she didn't fit the image, never knowing the man watching was the CEO in disguise. Her skin got her turned away. His skin built the empire. In a company ruled by silence, one anonymous post lit the fuse. But when truth walks in dressed as an intern, no system stays untouched. What if the person they tried to erase was the one rewriting the rules? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sunlight poured in through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the top floor in the Monarch Tower, casting clean golden lines across the cold marble table. At its center sat a man too large for the custom leather chair beneath him, but he made no fuss. Shaquille O'Neal, known in circles both respectful and afraid as Big Shaq, surveyed the space with eyes trained in stillness. The polished chrome, the brushed steel, the carefully curated pieces of abstract art, all symbols of success, yet none of it impressed him. The company was called Neon Apex, a high-luxury tech brand known for making impossible things look effortless. Electric vehicles with whisper-quiet engines, AI systems so human they could apologize, wearable tech that felt like silk. To the public, Neon Apex was the crown jewel of modern America. To Shaq, it was the empire he built not out of ambition but resistance. Not a single wall bore his portrait, not one corridor whispered his name. That was by design. Most assumed the CEO was a reclusive white billionaire, a myth constructed by the PR team and gladly accepted by investors who associated genius with a particular complexion. Shaq never corrected them. Instead, he let his appointed executives play the face, while he stayed behind the scenes, pulling strings with silent dignity. He wasn't hiding. He was watching. The executive boardroom smelled faintly of sandalwood and cold coffee. Across the table, department heads bantered over projections, product life cycles, and consumer behavior. None of them noticed Shaq's fingers tracing the edge of a coffee cup, a mind somewhere far deeper than their statistics could touch. He had learned long ago how to exist just enough to be ignored, even when standing 7'1" and commanding a global company. It was never about volume, it was about presence, and his presence, though quiet, shifted rooms. His mother, Lucille, had taught him how to command without barking orders. He carried her voice like an anchor. Never let them think your size is your strength. Let your stillness scare them instead. He'd lived by that. There had been rooms in his early years where chairs weren't offered, resumes were taken with raised eyebrows, and meetings ended before they began. But Shaq had turned rejection into resolve. The scars didn't vanish, they just blended into the silhouette of the man he'd become. Neon Apex wasn't inherited, it was earned. In the early days, when the company was nothing more than an idea scribbled in a spiral-bound notebook, investors dismissed him before he even opened his mouth. One called him too urban, another questioned his literacy. They didn't realize they were lighting a fire. Shaq took those dismissals and turned them into fuel. He hired engineers from overlooked schools. He paid interns living wages. He built labs in underserved districts. Every glass panel in this tower had a crack behind it. Not visible, but real. Because he remembered every time a door had slammed in his face. The current board members, mostly polished men in fitted suits with inherited networks, operated under the illusion that Shaq was just a figurehead. They knew he made the big decisions, but not the quiet ones. The decisions that rerouted budgets, rewrote hiring policies, and redirected opportunities. They didn't know he watched every internal rejection report, especially the ones where the disqualified names sounded familiar, names that echoed the cadence of his own people. Shaq read them all. Just last week, he'd seen a rejection summary that didn't sit right. A young black woman, top of her class at a competitive university, had been denied an internship. The reason listed was vague, not aligned with brand culture. The file was closed and forgotten within minutes. But Shaq remembered it. The name Zariah Miles etched itself into the back of his mind. She reminded him of someone, maybe himself, maybe his cousin who never got the shot, maybe every young dreamer who walked into a glass tower and left with less than what they came in with. He leaned back in the chair, letting the chatter in the room dissolve into a background hum. He wasn't angry. Anger was wasted fuel. He was calculating. He knew something was broken inside the walls of Neon Apex, and fixing it would require more than a memo. It would require disruption, but not loud, chaotic disruption. Something quieter, strategic, infiltrative. He'd start by bringing her back. Shaq's assistant entered the room briefly, placing a folder beside his untouched coffee. He glanced at it. A list of external outreach initiatives, part of a new diversity campaign the board had approved without much enthusiasm. They treated it like PR decoration. Shaq saw it as a lever. Within that file, he would place Zariah Miles' name under a different header. Not an internship this time, but a special project fellowship under a new mentorship initiative. He would make sure she returned, not because she needed a second chance, but because the company needed its first real test. As the meeting wound down, the executives filtered out with their polished smiles and empty buzzwords. Shaq remained seated, eyes now on the cityscape sprawling beyond the glass. LA was always moving, always hungry, but beneath its lights lived millions of stories unseen. Some faded, some erased, some never allowed to begin. He wasn't just building a company, he was carving space, for voices silenced, for skin tones unwelcome in boardrooms, for girls like Zare, who were told they didn't belong by people too blind to recognize brilliance draped in melanin. Outside, the sun had begun its slow descent toward the Pacific, casting gold over the horizon. Shaq finally rose from the chair, body towering like a monument. He didn't speak to anyone on his way out, didn't need to. His silence carried a plan, and by tomorrow morning, the company would begin to feel a shift, one they wouldn't see coming, one born not from fury, but from focus. What they didn't know was that the man they'd underestimated had been building this moment for years. The face behind the desk wasn't just a CEO. He was the storm disguised as a calm day, and now he was moving. Zariah Miles had spent the night before rehearsing her elevator pitch in front of a cracked mirror, her voice confident, her hope louder. She wore her curls tied back into a neat bun, her blazer pressed with precision, her shoes silent against the floor as she walked through the revolving doors of Neon Apex's headquarters. To her, the lobby felt like a cathedral of ambition, polished floors, curated artwork, receptionists who looked like magazine covers. She entered it with purpose, unaware that within a few short hours, the very place that held her dreams would casually discard them. She had worked too hard for this. Valedictorian, robotics club captain, internships completed while juggling 3 part-time jobs. She'd read every article on Neon Apex, studied its founder's philosophy, mapped its technology evolution year by year. She even memorized the company's lesser-known sustainability metrics, just in case. The night before, she whispered to herself in bed, "This is the one." At reception, she gave her name. The assistant smiled, looked her over a second too long, then typed something quickly. Zariah didn't flinch, didn't show the slight pinch she felt at the delay. She'd learned long ago how to wait, how to stay professional, even when people scanned her like she didn't belong. Upstairs, the interviews were less conversations and more coded interrogations. They asked about her cultural fit, about how she might handle high-end clientele, and what her exposure to luxury markets had been. The questions weren't hostile, but they weren't neutral either. They were glazed in something too subtle to name, and too sharp to ignore. No one commented on her resume's rigor or her portfolio's innovation. They talked about tone, polish, and alignment. She answered everything with the grace of someone used to navigating landmines, but she could feel the tide shifting. When she left the room, she already knew. By the time the rejection email landed in her inbox that evening, its clinical language only confirmed what her gut had whispered the moment the HR manager had smiled too tightly at her skin. "Thank you for your time, but we've decided to move forward with candidates who more closely match our brand aesthetic." That phrase, brand aesthetic, hung in her throat like a stone. She wasn't rejected because she lacked talent. She was rejected because her presence didn't match the image they'd already decided was worthy of being seen. She sat alone in her small apartment that night, blinds drawn to keep out the LA sun, staring at the rejection. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she typed and deleted a dozen variations of a response. Professional, then angry, then resigned. Finally, she opened a blank post on a community job forum and wrote anonymously, "They rejected me because of my skin. My qualifications were strong, my ideas stronger, but I wasn't what they wanted in their lobby, their conference rooms, their branding." She didn't name the company. She didn't need to. The story wasn't new. It wasn't even surprising. That was the worst part. She wasn't angry in the traditional sense. She was exhausted. Generational exhaustion. In that one afternoon, her confidence had been dissected by 1,000 invisible blades. Not with insults, but with stares, pauses, and curated smiles that masked rejection dressed in luxury. Meanwhile, at Neon Apex, her name was quietly erased from the applicant database. No one discussed her interview. No one questioned why she had been passed over. Her file was closed with the same corporate indifference used to dismiss hundreds before her. People who didn't look the part, whatever that part was. No one in the building wondered where Zariah was now. That was the true violence, the erasure. But what no one knew was that someone had seen her file. Someone who read between the lines. Someone who didn't need the name of the intern to recognize the shape of what had happened. In the executive suite, Shaquille O'Neal had sat quietly that morning, watching the results of a hiring report flow across his private dashboard. He noticed her name. He noticed the vague language, and he felt it, the sting of memory. Because once he'd walked into boardrooms and felt the exact same silence. Once, he'd been told he didn't project leadership. Once, his skin had entered the room before his resume. And just like Zariah, he'd walked out knowing the truth before they bothered to send it. Zariah, however, didn't know she'd been seen. She didn't know her story, posted late that night to a small but growing online forum, had reached the eyes of someone who understood every unspoken insult in her day. She didn't know that while she sat on the edge of her bed, wondering if she should apply again or just walk away from it all, the tides at Neon Apex had already begun to shift. She didn't know that Big Shaq, the man behind the glass tower, had already set a plan in motion. Not one of pity, but of redirection. Not to save her, but to clear the path that had been unjustly blocked. For Zariah, this day felt like the end of something. But for Shaq, it was the beginning. And while she lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind echoing every microaggression she endured that afternoon, far above the city lights, the gears inside the machine began to shift quietly, carefully, powerfully, because sometimes the loudest justice begins in silence. The post didn't trend. It didn't explode with hashtags or spark a wave of online outrage. It moved like smoke, unseen, slow but suffocating when it finally settled. Buried in the corner of a professional forum meant for rising creatives and recent graduates, the post lived quietly under an anonymous profile. No photo, no school name, no time-stamped anger. Just a few lines typed in a moment of heartbreak. They rejected me because of my skin. Shaquille O'Neal scrolled past it once. Then again. The words sat heavy on the screen. Short enough to miss, sharp enough to wound. He didn't need more context. He didn't need the name. The words were too familiar to ignore. Like hearing your own story told through someone else's breath. He sat at his desk in the early hours of morning, the city still half asleep, and read it again. This wasn't the kind of injustice that came crashing through windows or shouted in the streets. It was the kind that dressed itself in politeness, shook hands with a smile, and closed doors without ever saying why. The kind Shaq had faced years ago when he walked into meeting rooms where the air grew tighter the darker his skin appeared. The kind where success didn't erase suspicion, it just made it quieter, more calculated. He leaned back in his chair, the sleek hum of Neon Apex's private dashboard flickering on the monitor behind him. His entire empire had been built on knowing when to speak and when to watch, and right now he was watching a ghost of his past bleed into someone else's present. The sentence echoed in his mind not as a headline, but as a warning. Someone inside his walls had made that girl feel invisible, and that was unacceptable. What caught his attention wasn't just the pain in the post, it was the precision. The way she didn't scream. She didn't name names. She didn't beg for sympathy. She just told the truth. And truth, when shared with restraint, has a way of finding the right ears. That week, the post quietly spread through industry circles. A few talent scouts passed it around in group chats. One or two mid-level managers forwarded it with a shrug, but most ignored it. To them, it was just another voice in a crowded feed. No scandal, no traction, no need for cleanup. But Shaq wasn't most people. The anonymity of the author only sharpened his focus. He didn't need a photo to understand who she was. He'd seen that profile 1,000 times in the early days. Full of dreams, sharp credentials, and a name that made executives pause before they ever read the resume. He knew what it felt like to be dismissed in a suit that cost more than the person's car. He knew the sting of rejection camouflaged as not the right fit. He stood by the window of his private office, 30 floors above the city, staring out at the skyline with a stillness that belied the storm building inside him. The problem wasn't just her rejection, it was that it had happened inside his house. Neon Apex, his company, his creation. Somewhere, somehow, the culture had shifted, or maybe it had never truly changed. Maybe the beast he thought he'd tamed had been growing in silence, while he focused on innovation and expansion. He pulled up internal reports, scrolling through rejection metrics, hiring patterns, departmental notes. One after another, he saw the same patterns: sanitized language, vague feedback, coded terminology, not a cultural match, lacking executive polish, didn't meet brand tone. And always beneath those lines, names that looked like hers, names that once looked like his. He knew he couldn't make a move publicly. Not yet. The board would demand data. The media would twist it. The racists would scoff and say she was playing the victim. But Shaq wasn't interested in optics. He was interested in results, and that required strategy. He pulled up the name from the internship report he remembered. Zariah Miles. She hadn't just been qualified. She'd been exceptional. Her application had been one of the most impressive in the last cycle, and yet she had been filtered out within hours. No red flags, no weak points, just the wrong skin. He closed the report and stared at the blank space on his note screen. Slowly, he typed out 3 words. Find her quietly. The words weren't a directive, they were a promise. Elsewhere in the city, Soraya sat on a city bench, headphones in, blocking out the world with lo-fi beats and internal battles. She had no idea her post had been seen. No idea her words had cut into the conscience of the man she'd unknowingly written about. She assumed the story would disappear, like everything else in a world designed to forget women who looked like her the moment they stopped smiling. She didn't know that her whisper had reached the only man in the company with the power to change everything. And he wasn't interested in saving her. He was interested in making sure what happened to her wouldn't happen again. Not at Neon Apex, not on his watch. In the days that followed, quiet gears began to turn. HR departments received encrypted audit alerts. A new internal initiative, proposed as forward-looking equity restructuring, was approved with limited fanfare, and a slot appeared on a private fellowship roster under the name Emergent Vision Talent Track. Unofficially, it was a door being reopened. Officially, it was just another line in a budget. But for Shaq, it was more. Because he'd heard the whisper, and it reminded him that even an empire built on silence has to listen. The glass tower looked no different the second time Soraya walked through its revolving doors. Same spotless floors, same curated flower arrangements, same receptionist who didn't look up the first time she spoke. But something had shifted. Not in the building, but in her. This time, she wasn't here as an intern hopeful, but as part of the Emergent Vision Talent Track, a highly exclusive pilot program nobody seemed to know much about. She hadn't applied. She hadn't been told how she was selected. The email had come quietly, like a ghost invitation with no strings attached, only an offer. Real work, meaningful projects, direct exposure to top leadership. It felt too good to be true. It was. Behind the scenes, Shaquille O'Neal moved without a title. No limousines, no introductions, no suits that screamed power. Instead, he wore a low-profile name badge and a crisp neutral shirt. To Soraya, he was Mr. Elijah, an executive liaison appointed to guide her through her rotation. She didn't recognize him, and he made sure she wouldn't. The lighting in the building softened his face, and the absence of cameras or crowds dimmed the public persona. Without the limelight, Big Shaq disappeared, leaving behind the observer, and that was exactly who he needed to be. He watched her enter the project briefing room that morning, sharp-eyed and steady, notebook in hand, posture alert. She greeted everyone, even those who didn't greet her back. The room was filled with middle managers, tech leads, and a few creative directors. None of them seemed particularly interested in her presence. They skimmed over her input, interrupted her halfway through ideas, and occasionally offered backhanded praise disguised as mentoring. She didn't flinch, not once. But Shaq saw what they didn't, the slight tightening of her jaw. The extra breath before answering, the way her eyes scanned the room for someone who would actually listen. The test, as it turned out, wasn't hers. It was his. He had assumed the system could be nudged from within, that minor policy shifts, a quiet hire, and a few back-channel corrections would begin to crack the surface. But what he saw unfolding in front of him wasn't a surface flaw, it was rot. Silent, comfortable rot embedded in tone, posture, and unspoken rules. These weren't people screaming discrimination. These were people who smiled while practicing it. They thought they were progressive. They thought ignoring her wasn't racist, just indifferent, and that indifference was louder than any slur. Soraya was assigned to a strategy team for a product launch slated to redefine Neon Apex's voice tech division. She proposed reworking the audio AI's tone recognition model to accommodate diverse speech cadences, an idea brilliant in both technical and ethical terms. Her suggestion was logged, then buried. Days later, the team lead, a man named Grayson Reddick, presented it during a meeting as his own. When she raised an eyebrow, he shot back a professional smile that said, "This is how the game is played." No one questioned it. No one corrected it. Shaq didn't intervene. Not yet. He observed, his silence now a scalpel. He sat through 3 more meetings where Zoraya's insights were redirected, reworded, or dismissed. Once she suggested a branding shift toward inclusive marketing narratives. A designer laughed. "We're not running charity campaigns." She didn't respond. She simply scribbled something in her notebook, nodded, and moved on. But Shaq was taking notes too. Mental, strategic, and deeply personal. Later that week, he arranged a one-on-one feedback session. In a modest glass office with muted walls and no security detail, he asked her how she was adjusting. She hesitated. He noticed. She chose her words carefully, too carefully. "It's good exposure," she said. "I'm learning a lot. It's a challenging environment." That last phrase lingered. He let the silence stretch. When she left the room, Shaq sat alone, the weight of her restraint pressing harder than anything she'd said aloud. She was smart enough to know not to complain too soon. She was already fighting not to be seen as difficult, and he had given her no reason to believe Mr. Elijah was anything more than a polite assistant with no real authority. But Shaq's authority was absolute. That night he reviewed archived meeting footage, flagged comments, and pulled departmental bias reports he'd had quietly activated since she returned. The data wasn't just ugly, it was damning. Across the division, diversity hires were consistently passed over for credit, denied high-impact projects, and filtered out from leadership grooming. The metrics were systemic, and until now, hidden. The irony was brutal. In a company that sold intelligence, there was a staggering lack of awareness. He looked over Zariah's performance evaluations. Despite what he witnessed firsthand, her reviews were tepid at best. Coded language like shows potential, could benefit from mentorship, still adjusting to culture. Culture, he thought bitterly, had become the modern shield for prejudice. And in those vague words, he could hear a younger version of himself being told he was too urban for leadership. The next morning, Shaq stood in the corner of the boardroom as a silent observer during another pitch. Zariah's team was presenting final concepts. She stood at the front this time, no permission asked. Grayson looked uncomfortable, but didn't interrupt. She walked them through user behavior analysis, comparative benchmarks, and a complete rewrite of the auditory UX matrix, all delivered with calm, commanding clarity. The room fell silent at the end. For once, there were no smirks, no laughter, just stillness. Shaq met her eyes across the room. She didn't smile, and neither did he. But something passed between them, an invisible acknowledgement, not of victory, but of arrival. She didn't know who he was, but he knew exactly who she was. And now so did everyone else. The transformation began without announcements. No press release, no town hall meeting, no internal memo hinting at a revolution. It was deliberate, a quiet storm threaded through spreadsheets, policy drafts, and calendar invites. Shaquille O'Neal, still operating under the alias of Mr. Elijah, rewired the foundation of Neon Apex from the inside, careful not to trigger the alarm bells of those too comfortable in their unchecked privilege. It started in HR, the department's long-standing director, a man who prided himself on brand integrity, was reassigned to an ambiguous role in international compliance. The team beneath him was reshuffled overnight. A woman named Talia Grover, sharp, principled, and previously overlooked for promotion, was appointed to lead. Shaq didn't give her the job. He simply moved the obstacles that had kept her from it. She stepped into the role with both empathy and fire, immediately revising the performance review framework and introducing blind evaluations in the internship process. It looked like modernization. In truth, it was liberation. Zariah didn't see the strings being pulled. She was too focused on delivering results. Since her full entry into the fellowship program, she'd become an undeniable force in the product strategy team. Her insights no longer sat in silence. Her ideas, once stolen, now became the blueprint others followed. Still, she moved with caution. Success had not made her forget what rejection tasted like. It had only taught her to scan every room for danger, even when cloaked in praise. But one person never made her feel watched: Mr. Elijah. The assistant who always asked the right questions but never offered answers unless she invited them. He was never overbearing, never performed allyship, never made her feel like a project. He simply stood near, present, observant, patient. There was something about the way he nodded when she spoke, the way his eyes flicked toward her when someone else interrupted, the way he let her own every moment. To her, he was just a kind man, assigned to a mentorship track. To the company, he was invisible. To the racists in corner offices, he was the beginning of the end. Shaq had always known the rot wouldn't leave willingly. It had to be outmaneuvered. So he played chess while they played entitlement. Department budgets were audited. Project teams were reshaped. A new executive review board was quietly formed to oversee internal misconduct patterns. Its members handpicked from departments where integrity had long been outnumbered. They met off-site, off-record, off-radar. Every policy looked standard on paper, but in practice they shifted the entire gravitational field. Some execs noticed, the ones who'd always spoken in code. She doesn't quite have the polish. We're protecting the brand tone. We can't alienate our core consumer base. Now found their decision-making slowed. Their suggestions required justification. Their access to hiring approvals narrowed. It wasn't dramatic, but it was unsettling. The walls once so sturdy around them felt softer, and none of them knew why. One in particular, Camden Wolfe, had sensed it early. He had built his entire ascent on navigating around regulations, mastering the corporate language of exclusion. But lately his rejections were being reversed. His recommendations reevaluated. And worst of all, someone was reviewing his conduct logs. The quiet checks in the system, the kind no one ever paid attention to, were now lit like landmines. He watched Zariah rise through the ranks with increasing suspicion. She was smart, too smart, and he didn't believe in coincidences. But what unnerved him more was the presence of the assistant, Elijah. Camden had once caught him standing too still in a hallway after a meeting, eyes closed, listening to something only he could hear. Something about that man felt too composed, too knowing. He made a note to dig deeper. Meanwhile, Shaq continued his slow rebellion. He began offering unscheduled listening sessions with junior employees, billed as a new feedback initiative. No cameras, no names attached. Zariah attended one, not knowing the man behind the tinted glass was the very person watching her trajectory. She spoke candidly, cautiously. She described her early rejection as expected but painful. She didn't blame the company outright. But her voice cracked when she said, "It makes you feel like your brilliance has to wear a costume just to get in the door." Shaq never forgot that line. He drafted an internal review framework that night titled Unmasked Merit. It wasn't marketed. It didn't need to be. HR implemented it the following month. Promotion metrics changed. Cultural alignment was no longer scored on polish, but on purpose. Zariah, meanwhile, began training interns of her own. 2 of them young black women, who looked at her with a mix of awe and caution. She never told them what she'd been through. She just made sure they never felt it. Shaq kept his distance. He had promised himself he wouldn't interfere emotionally, but watching Zariah navigate the halls he built, with a posture that no longer shrank, stirred something in him. Pride, yes, but also a kind of sorrow. Because this company should have celebrated her from day one, and instead it almost broke her. But she hadn't broken. She had bloomed. And those who once dismissed her were now learning to watch their words, their assumptions, their patterns. They didn't know who was tightening the chain around their power, but they felt it. Every unexplained denial, every policy reversal, every cautious glance from new HR reps who no longer smiled politely through misconduct. They were being outmaneuvered. And all the while, the man responsible stood beside them in elevators, sat across from them in meetings, poured his own coffee in the break room. The man they thought was an assistant, quiet, respectful, irrelevant, was in fact the architect of their undoing. The power they ignored had been hiding in plain sight. And the girl they tried to erase was now the compass guiding everything forward. Camden Wolfe had built his career on noticing what others ignored. The off-script behavior, the subtext in smiles, the shifting power balances hidden beneath polite agendas. That instinct, honed in years of backroom dealings and boardroom diplomacy, was now throbbing with unease. Something was changing inside Neon Apex. Not visibly, not all at once, but in ways that made his skin crawl. It started with missing files. Not stolen, not deleted, just absent. Performance evaluations he'd flagged for follow-up were no longer where they should have been. A pipeline candidate with a pristine pedigree had his application quietly removed from the shortlist, replaced with someone Camden didn't recognize. And hiring patterns, once comfortably curated to fit the image he believed the brand should project, were shifting. There was a new face in every department, every team, young, driven, unapologetically diverse, and they weren't afraid to speak. More disturbing, no one was silencing them. Camden didn't like it. Not because he opposed progress. He knew how to say the right things when the right people were watching. But because he wasn't in control of it. Someone was pulling strings. And whoever it was understood the system too well to be new. He narrowed his focus. At the center of the disruption was the intern girl, Zariah Miles. She wasn't loud or defiant, but there was something dangerous about her presence. Her ideas were bold, and worse, they were being accepted. In the past, he'd seen others like her pushed to the side, dismissed quietly, layered with polite rejections. But this one, she was being protected. Camden started watching her. She met privately with project leads. She was granted clearance to proprietary strategy tools. She'd even submitted a product framework directly to the R&D pipeline, something no fellow had ever done. She didn't act like someone testing waters. She moved like she'd been promised the ocean. That bothered him. And then there was Mr. Elijah, the assistant. He'd been introduced 6 months ago with almost no background, just a file stamped from executive operations, and a job description too vague to challenge. No LinkedIn, no interviews, no digital trail. Camden had noticed him before, always quiet, always observing, rarely speaking. But now he was everywhere. Zariah went, sometimes behind her, sometimes beside her, always silent, always calm. The rest of the team ignored him, thought of him as another overpaid handler in a polished company full of unnecessary roles. But Camden saw it. Elijah never took notes. He never asked questions. He only listened. And that was what made Camden suspicious. He ran a background search. Nothing came up. Literally a clean slate. No educational records. No employment history. No identifiable footprint. That wasn't rare for senior-level shadow hires from third-party firms. But this felt different. Elijah wasn't auditing. He wasn't monitoring. He was guiding. Camden started looking for moments, patterns anywhere this assistant had left fingerprints. He reviewed meeting logs, timestamps, employee access records. Elijah's presence appeared across departments, across projects, across restructuring notes. Always at the edge of policy changes. Always just before decisions shifted. It wasn't a coincidence. As the company prepared for its annual investor summit, the largest and most scrutinized event on its calendar, Camden felt pressure mounting. Stakeholders would be watching. Financial media would attend. This was the time when Neon Apex paraded its executives, its numbers, its innovations. But this year, everything felt uncertain. Marketing briefs were behind schedule. Product demos had been reassigned. And for the first time in 5 years, the CEO had not previewed a summit agenda. There had been no rehearsal, no directive from the top. In fact, the CEO hadn't been seen. Camden leaned closer to his monitor. A security flag had triggered someone accessing restricted files related to early investor correspondence and internal board compliance. The access trail led nowhere, but the login ID matched a back-end administrative account, one Camden had approved 3 years ago. He followed the digital breadcrumbs and found system pings originating from an office that shouldn't have had that clearance. Mr. Elijah's workspace. He filed a quiet request for IT audit. That same afternoon, he stepped into the design wing, watching from the glass as Zaria led a small team in finalizing a voice interface demo. She was calm, assertive, no stumbling, no insecurity. The others deferred to her naturally, not because of power, but presence. She carried herself like someone who knew the ceiling didn't exist. He turned away before she could catch his stare. On the elevator ride down, he ran into Elijah. The man nodded once, cordial, controlled. Camden smiled back too quickly.
"What department did you say you were from again?" he asked casually.
Executive liaison, Elijah replied, unfazed. Camden narrowed his eyes. Strange, I've been here a long time. Usually I know everyone with that title. Elijah said nothing. The elevator doors opened. He stepped out with quiet steps, leaving behind a silence heavier than the ride itself. Camden's pulse ticked. Something wasn't right. Later that evening, alone in his apartment, he pulled up archived press footage. Random scattered clips, old press conferences, launch events, charity campaigns. Then he paused. There it was. A distant shot, Neon Apex's founder at a tech symposium 4 years ago. The man on stage, the face now faintly familiar. Broader shoulders, a different beard then, but unmistakable. Big Shaq. He zoomed in. Then cross-referenced a still from security footage taken earlier this week. Elijah. His mouth went dry. He stood up too quickly, heart pounding, mind racing. If Elijah was Shaquille O'Neal, if the founder, the CEO, had been walking among them this whole time, unannounced, unrecognized, then everything made sense. The restructuring, the hires, the reversals, the surveillance, the changes. He hadn't lost control. He'd never had it. Camden stared at the images, connecting the unthinkable. Zaria's meteoric rise wasn't a fluke. It was orchestrated. Not favoritism. No. Precision. Purpose. She wasn't being handed a seat. She was being planted as the future. And the man no one noticed? He was building something. Or destroying something. Maybe both. Camden sat back, hands trembling, unsure whether to confront, expose or stay quiet. One wrong move and he'd be out. One step too loud and the entire tower might turn against him, because now he knew the secret. And he was almost too late to stop it. The investor summit was Neon Apex's grandest illusion. Part spectacle, part strategy, all polished perfection. Every year the event drew the industry's elite to a stage dressed in glass and light, where CEOs unveiled just enough of the future to inflate stock value, but never enough to reveal the truth. Cameras panned over expensive suits and curated smiles. Journalists lined the outer rows with notepads sharpened and eyes trained for headlines. Nothing was ever out of place. That was the entire point. This year, however, something felt off. The venue, a converted aviation hangar on the edge of Silicon Beach, had been transformed into a cathedral of innovation. LED strips shimmered along curved steel walls. Suspended screens played brand films in rhythmic loops. Guests were handed earbud translators, vegan hors d'oeuvres, and augmented reality name badges. Every detail screamed control. But backstage, the order was slipping. The keynote schedule had gone unconfirmed. PR managers were missing their prep briefings. The media team whispered about a last-minute shift in presentation order, though no one could say who approved it. And the most jarring absence of all, Shaquille O'Neal, the CEO, had yet to arrive. He wasn't seen in the green room. No car at the executive entrance. No call from his office. Tension leaked into every corridor. Camden Wolfe, dressed in charcoal gray and wearing a smile he didn't feel, paced behind the curtain, phone in hand. He'd spent the past 48 hours rewatching footage, digging through old press releases, checking timestamps. The pattern was too perfect. Elijah was Shaq. It was no longer a suspicion. It was fact. But proving it wouldn't help him. Not today. Not here. The board wasn't listening. The media wasn't interested. And Shaq, wherever he was, held all the cards. Camden had prepared a short address in case the CEO no-showed. He didn't want to deliver it. But if it came to that, he was ready. Back in the audience, Zariah sat in the fourth row from the stage, badge clipped straight, nerves wound tight. She had no speaking role, no official responsibility, but something told her she was here for more than observation. She'd felt the energy shift all morning. People had greeted her differently. Some avoided eye contact. A few offered forced smiles. One woman in operations even leaned in and whispered, "You look nice. Big day for you?" before walking away without explanation. Zariah couldn't shake the feeling that someone had handed her a script but forgotten to include the lines. At exactly 11 a.m., the lights dimmed. A voice boomed over the sound system, polished and confident. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Neon Apex Annual Summit. Please direct your attention to the screen for a short film before our keynote speaker takes the stage." A hush fell over the audience. The screen blinked. Then the film began. Not a product demo, not a brand anthem, just a black screen with white text. "They rejected me because of my skin." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Then came the voice. A young woman. Honest, wounded, steady. Zariah's voice. The audio, lifted from her anonymous post, filled the massive room. There were no edits, no name, just her story. They didn't say it directly. They never do. They just smiled while subtracting me from the future. The screen lit up with images, not of her, but of rooms, silent boardrooms, vacant conference tables, empty seats where opportunity never sat. Then came data, unfiltered hiring charts, anonymous evaluations, notes labeled not a fit, too assertive, culturally risky, real reports, internal documents, quiet proof of systemic rot. The room was frozen. Executives shifted. PR teams panicked. Investors whispered. Zariah sat motionless, her face a mask of disbelief. She hadn't known this was coming. She hadn't recorded anything. That post had been anonymous. Private, long gone from the forum she'd posted it on. But here it was, broadcast to hundreds, reshaping the entire narrative of Neon Apex in a single uninterrupted breath. The screen faded to black. Then a final line appeared. "Truth belongs to those who've lived it." The lights returned, and out walked Shaquille O'Neal. Not Elijah, not the assistant. Big Shaq. There was no suit jacket, no fanfare, just a crisp black shirt, and presence heavy enough to quiet the world. He didn't walk fast. He didn't wave. He moved like the air belonged to him, and everyone else was simply borrowing it. For a full 10 seconds, he stood center stage and said nothing. Then his voice filled the space, low, steady, unmistakable. "I'm Shaquille O'Neal, and for the past year, I've walked these halls as someone else. No intro, no apology, just the truth. I became my own shadow, because I needed to see the company I built without the filter of power, and what I saw was unacceptable." Every screen in the room lit with his words, transcribed in real time. I saw brilliance ignored, potential dismissed, skin used as a silent disqualifier. I saw bias dressed as professionalism and bigotry hidden behind brand strategy. He turned slightly, facing the executives seated in the front row, including Camden Wolfe, who stared back like the air had been punched from his chest. I saw leaders who confuse culture with conformity, who believe excellence has a face, a tone, a background. Then he shifted again, eyes scanning the rows of young faces, the interns, the fellows, the quiet ones. But I also saw hope in the people who showed up anyway, in the voices that kept speaking even when no one listened. He paused. One of those voices was Zariah Miles. She didn't know I was watching. She didn't ask for a spotlight. She just showed up, again and again, refusing to shrink. All eyes turned to her. Zariah sat frozen, breath caught, vision blurring. Her name hadn't been mentioned in the video. But now, here it was, spoken on a stage she never thought she'd stand near. Shaq continued. Today isn't about exposure. It's about accountability. He gestured toward the screens, where now a chart displayed sweeping structural reforms, equity councils, audit transparency, leadership reshuffling. Camden's name and others were subtly included under review. We're not rebranding. We're rebuilding. He stepped back, voice softer now. This isn't my redemption. This is our reckoning. The room was silent, no clapping, no music cue. Just the hum of cameras capturing a truth no one could spin. He left the stage the same way he entered, calm, grounded, unshaken. Zarya remained seated long after the applause began, eyes fixed on the space where he'd stood, heart racing not from fear, but from a strange, overwhelming clarity. Everything had changed. Not for her, but because of her. The applause had faded, the lights had dimmed, and the hangar's grand space had begun to empty, but Zarya couldn't move. She sat frozen, staring at the stage where minutes ago, a man she thought she knew had stood and shattered everything she believed about power, truth, and herself. Mr. Elijah. That's what he was to her. The quiet presence in meetings, the steady voice in her most uncertain moments, the man who never took credit but always listened. He had been her anchor in a sea of thin smiles and silent bias, and now, she knew. He was Shaquille O'Neal, the CEO, the face she had never seen in boardroom photos, because he never put himself there. The voice behind the walls she once thought too high to scale. Her mentor had been the man running the entire empire. Zarya's breath caught in her chest. Her knees went weak as she stood, the truth hitting her in waves, not as betrayal, but as a revelation so vast it made the air too heavy to breathe. Her first instinct was disbelief, a desperate need to rewind time, to find the cracks she had missed. His mannerisms, the way he stood slightly apart, the pauses when others spoke over her, the silence he used as power, it had all been there. But she hadn't seen him, not truly, not until he chose to reveal himself. Now, she was remembering everything differently. The way he guided her without directing, how he let her fail, but never fall, how he once told her, "You don't need to be louder, you just need to stand longer." It had meant something to her then. Now, it meant everything. Her mind spiraled back to the first day, the second chance she never asked for but somehow received. At the time she thought it was a clerical correction, a new initiative that found her by luck. But it wasn't luck, it was him. He'd watched her walk into that building the first time, and be reduced to a line in a file. He'd seen it happen, and instead of stepping in with a grand rescue, he created a path, not paved, not gilded, just clear. And then he let her decide to walk it. Zarya stepped outside into the muted Los Angeles afternoon, the sky gray and stretched thin above the city. Reporters lingered near exits, staff buzzed through security gates. But no one stopped her. No one recognized her yet, not as the voice from the video, not as the girl who once sat in the shadows. She didn't go home. Instead, she walked. Block after block, memory crashing against emotion, until she reached a small coffee shop she used to study in during her undergrad days, the kind with chipped tables and hand-painted signs. She ordered the same drink she always had, and sat by the window, letting the steam fog the glass as her thoughts tried to make sense of what she'd just lived through. Her pain had been real. The rejection, it hadn't been a test or a lesson or a misunderstood policy. It had been racism, straightforward and brutal. They had looked at her and said no, without ever saying why. That wound had bled quietly for months, but now her healing came from the same skin they said didn't belong. That irony was heavy, beautiful, but heavy. What did it mean to be mentored by the very man she once assumed didn't exist in the upper floors of that building? It meant the ceiling was never about glass. It was about mirrors. And she had been taught to stop looking up, and instead to start looking through. Zarya wasn't angry that Shaq hadn't told her. She understood now. If he had revealed himself too soon, she might have doubted her wins. She might have thought his presence was her safety net, not her witness. He didn't rescue her. He watched her rescue herself, and only when she stood tall on her own did he stand beside her in the light. She pulled out her phone, opened the Notes app, and began typing. Not a response, not a post, just a thought she couldn't contain. I spent so long trying to convince them I belonged. I never realized I was being prepared to lead instead. She stared at it for a long time. Back at the summit venue, Shaq sat alone in a side room. No cameras, no fanfare, just silence. His speech had been calculated but sincere. He hadn't written it until the night before, unsure if the world was ready to hear the truth without spin. But he hadn't written it for the world, he wrote it for her. He remembered watching Zariah walk into that building the first time. How determined she looked. How quickly she was dismissed. How quietly she walked out. Pride intact but heart visibly broken. He remembered pulling her file from the system, reading her resume 3 times, thinking, she shouldn't need me to fix this. She should never have been failed to begin with. Now, watching her rise, he felt something beyond vindication. It was legacy. It was the quiet echo of his mother's words. When you lift one, you lift a line behind her. Shaq had never needed recognition. But seeing Zariah step into her own, without needing his name, was the first time he felt he had truly changed something. Not through force, not through position, but through faith in her, in timing, in truth. Zariah closed her notebook and stood from the cafe table. Her heart was steady now, not because the pain was gone, but because it had finally found a name and a witness. She wasn't the girl trying to belong anymore. She was the girl who didn't know she'd already arrived. The boardroom had never felt this quiet. It wasn't the kind of silence born from efficiency or focus. It was the silence of reckoning. Taut, dense, uneasy. For years, the executives of Neon Apex had sat in this room, surrounded by glass walls and filtered privilege, believing their version of leadership was secure. But now, with their names attached to a company freshly shaken by public exposure and internal revolt, they sat still, waiting to see just how far the fallout would reach. Shaquille O'Neal entered with the same unassuming gait he had perfected as Mr. Elijah, only this time no one dared ignore him. There were no second glances at his title, no dismissals cloaked in executive smiles. The mask was gone. The weight of his authority earned, not imposed, filled the space before he said a single word. He didn't sit. He didn't smile. Instead, he walked toward the digital panel embedded at the head of the table and pressed a button that lit the wall-to-wall screen behind him. The Neon Apex logo dissolved into a spreadsheet. Crisp, unblinking rows of data, all anonymized, all damning. Let's skip the pleasantries, he said calmly. This is where the bias lives. Columns revealed hiring statistics broken down by department, ethnicity, gender, and outcomes. The patterns were unmistakable. Black applicants were disproportionately filtered out before the final interview stage. Latinos and women of color scored above average in skills tests but were routinely passed over. Exit interviews showed consistent patterns of isolation and coded feedback, didn't mesh with the team, struggled with our tone, better suited elsewhere. Shaq turned from the screen and faced the men and women seated around him. These aren't just numbers, they're receipts. Camden Wolfe sat 2 chairs from the head, jaw tight, eyes shifting toward the floor. He had known this day was coming since the summit. What he didn't know was how deep the audit would go, and how personal. Shaq pulled out a thick binder and slid it across the table toward him. That's your department's 3-year review, line by line, candidate by candidate, and for every talented black applicant you denied, we tracked the reason. Camden opened the binder, flipping past highlighted sections that didn't need explanation. His fingerprints were everywhere, feedback notes marked in his own language. Not executive enough, concerns with communication style, lack of cultural alignment. Shaq didn't shout, he didn't accuse. He simply stood and let the truth settle like dust in their throats. This company was built to challenge the world, not mirror its prejudice. He moved down the table, handing out smaller folders, individualized reports on departmental bias trends, all scrubbed by a third-party ethics consultancy brought in without announcement. The data had been verified, the decisions documented. There was no spin left. Some execs tried to explain. We didn't mean for it to be. We follow standard HR practices. Shaq raised a hand, cutting them off with no need for volume. You didn't mean for it to be racist, but it was. He gestured to the screen again, now showing side-by-side bios. One of a black candidate with Ivy League credentials, who had been rejected 3 times, the other of a hired peer with a shorter resume but a familiar look. The difference was stark, the facts unarguable. This isn't about feelings, it's about facts. You chose comfort over courage, familiarity over fairness, and you did it behind these walls, under the illusion that progress was being made. The room felt smaller now, the walls tighter. But let me be clear, he continued. I'm not here to punish you. Several executives exhaled too soon. I'm here to change you. He detailed the measures being implemented: blind hiring panels, bias training led by lived experience experts, real consequences for repeat exclusionary practices. The executive bonus structure would now be partially tied to inclusion metrics, not just profit margins. Talent retention would no longer reward longevity alone, but mentorship impact. Promotion pipelines were being rebuilt from the ground up. No more silent filters. No more optics disguised as opportunity. Then he turned directly to Camden. "You will stay," he said plainly. "Not because you deserve to, but because you need to learn what real leadership looks like. You don't get to walk away from the mess you helped create. You stay, you grow, or you step aside." Camden's face hardened, but he nodded. Not in agreement, but in resignation. The rest of the room stayed silent. Shaq finally sat, slow and deliberate, letting the weight of what had been said settle into the foundation of the room. This company doesn't need new values. It needs to remember why it was built in the first place. He looked around the table, his gaze steady. "We've engineered silence into our systems for too long. It ends today. Quietly, but completely." He rose again, signaling the meeting's end. No handshakes, no reassurances, just a final quiet truth. "Justice," he said, "doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just shows up with the receipts." And with that he left them. Not angry, not triumphant, but resolved. The revolt hadn't come with flames or fists. It had come with facts. And that made it unstoppable. The limo ride out of Los Angeles was quiet. Not the tense kind of quiet Zaria was used to in elevators and boardrooms, but a soft, reflective hush, the kind that follows revelation and doesn't rush to fill the silence. The city shrank behind them as the roads widened and the skyline gave way to older streets lined with chain-link fences and weathered porches. She hadn't asked where they were going. When Shaq had told her, "There's something I want to show you," she didn't need details. She trusted him. They pulled into a modest cul-de-sac, the car rolling to a slow stop in front of a one-story brick house with faded shutters and a cracked driveway. It wasn't run down, but it wasn't dressed for guests either. It was lived in, real. The kind of place that held stories in its walls and resilience in its floorboards. Shaq stepped out first, then opened her door. She followed him up the short path to the porch. No guards, no cameras, just a screen door and the creak of wood underfoot. He knocked once. The door opened almost immediately. Lucille O'Neill stood in the doorway, apron on, hands dusted with flour, her expression warm but sharp. Her eyes didn't soften for the cameras because there were none. She looked at Zaria, then at her son, then back again. "You brought her," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Zaria offered a nervous smile. Lucille stepped aside. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and roasted coffee. Framed photos lined every wall. Shaq at different ages, family gatherings, a graduation cap here, a faded jersey there. It was a museum of memory. Nothing showy, nothing edited. They sat in the kitchen. Lucille poured tea, served homemade cornbread, then took her seat without ceremony. "I hear you've shaken up a few walls," she said to Zaria, a glint in her voice. Zaria lowered her gaze, unsure if it was praise or caution. "She didn't just shake them," Shaq said, leaning back in his chair. "She walked through them." Lucille nodded once, then turned to her son. "You finally showed your face." "I did," he said. "And?" "It worked." They sat for a moment in that shared understanding, a rhythm only mothers and sons could exchange. Then Lucille stood, motioning for Zaria to follow. Shaq remained seated. The hallway was narrow, leading to a small bedroom at the end. Inside, the walls were still painted a dusty blue. The twin bed was neatly made, books stacked high on the floor beside it. Posters of basketball legends, long yellowed with time, hung above a desk that still held an old-school radio and a cracked notebook. Lucille pointed to a mirror above the dresser. "He used to stare into that every night," she said, "practicing interviews, imagining stadiums, but not just for sports, for life." Zaria stepped closer to the mirror. It wasn't fancy, just an ordinary rectangle of glass framed in chipped wood. But as she looked into it, something settled inside her. She saw her reflection beside the faint outline of Shaq's in the mirror's age-warped glass. Their faces didn't match, but the story behind their eyes did. 2 different generations, 2 different paths, same fight. Lucille's voice came softer now. "He was told no so many times it stopped hurting. Too big, too slow, too black, too something. But he kept coming back." Zaria turned to her.
"I wasn't supposed to be here either."
Lucille gave a half smile. "None of us were. That's the point." They returned to the kitchen. Shaq stood now leaning against the counter, hands folded. He didn't speak right away. When he did, it wasn't the voice of a CEO, or a mentor, or a legend. It was the voice of someone remembering. "I was rejected more times than I can count," he said. "Not just on paper. In elevators, in interviews, in dinners where people shook my hand and never made eye contact. Sometimes because of how I talked. Most times because of how I looked." He looked at Zaria. You think success silences that, but it doesn't. It just makes the rooms quieter when it happens. She nodded, not needing more explanation. I watched you get pushed out of a room I built. That was my failure. But watching you come back anyway, that reminded me why I built it in the first place. He stepped forward and handed her something. A folded photo. It was of him, younger, maybe college-aged, standing in that same bedroom mirror, tie crooked, eyes defiant. That's the last time I looked in that mirror before I left home. I didn't know who I was becoming yet. I just knew I had to make space for someone else. Zariah held the photo carefully. You were making space for me, she whispered. No, he said. I was making space for whoever had the courage to claim it. Lucille rose, signaling the moment had been long enough. She hugged Zariah gently, firmly. Don't carry this story like a weight, she said. Carry it like a torch. Outside, the sun had begun to dip below the rooftops, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Zariah looked at the mirror one last time as they left, not for what it reflected, but for what it had witnessed. In that house, in that kitchen, in that moment, she understood what legacy really meant. It wasn't just about passing the baton. It was about making sure the track still existed for the next runner. And someone had made sure it did. By the end of the week, Neon Apex wasn't just a company, it was a headline. News cycles spun furiously in every direction. Major outlets ran clips of Shaq's summit speech, breaking it down frame by frame. Think pieces flooded blogs and corporate feeds, dissecting every phrase, every policy change, every eyebrow raised in that boardroom. Overnight, the company that once thrived on luxury silence became the center of a national conversation about quiet racism, executive accountability, and the future of inclusive leadership. But Shaquille O'Neal didn't grant interviews. He declined morning show invitations. He offered no Twitter thread, no press statement, no carefully scripted follow-up. He let the truth speak for itself and returned to work. What he did instead was quieter and far more deliberate. He took a portion of his annual bonus and redirected it toward the creation of the Apex Fellowship Initiative, a long-term mentorship and leadership development program for underrepresented talent in tech and strategy. It wasn't a PR move. It was structured, funded, and locked into the company's financial roadmap with board approval. It wasn't a pilot. It was permanent. And its first director? Zariah Miles. The announcement came not in a press conference, but through an internal bulletin and a single video message sent company-wide. In it, Shaq simply said, "When someone walks through fire, you don't let them walk alone. You build the bridge so others can follow." Then he introduced Zariah, not as a survivor of discrimination, but as a visionary ready to shape the future. Zariah accepted the role with poise, but no illusion. She knew the path ahead would not be smooth. One speech and one summit didn't dismantle a culture. Change had to be lived, not announced. And so she went to work. She started with conversations, real ones, not performance check-ins or curated DEI meetings, but roundtable talks in every department. No hierarchy, no filters, just open space to listen. And when people spoke, she listened fully. When they didn't, she invited them again later. Some employees, especially those who had built their power in silence, felt exposed. Others, surprisingly, leaned in. They wanted to learn, to unlearn, to do better. And it showed. Within weeks, internal messaging began to shift. Sensitivity training, once seen as a formality, was reshaped and led by facilitators with lived experience. Several who had dismissed it the first time now stayed after sessions, asking questions they once buried behind indifference. Not everyone stayed. A few executives resigned quietly, citing philosophical differences. No scandals, no exits framed in bitterness. Just the quiet acknowledgement that the world was moving, and they weren't prepared to move with it. But others, including some who had been part of the original problem, changed. Camden Wolfe became the most unexpected example. After months of audit exposure and accountability check-ins, he returned to the company in a new capacity, not as a decision-maker, but as an observer. Under Shaq's direction, Camden participated in every level of the sensitivity process, not as punishment, but as transformation. He listened. He sat across from candidates he would have once filtered out. He studied his own history, and in a moment few would ever see. He stood outside a training room after a session and said to Zariah, "I never knew what I wasn't seeing." She nodded once. That was enough. The company itself began to move differently. Hiring panels became more diverse, not to meet a quota, but to meet the reality of the world they served. Brand language shifted, no longer defaulting to imagery that erased, but rather amplified. The internal communication platforms added safe spaces for discussions that once felt risky to initiate. Not everything was perfect. Some resistance lingered, but no one could pretend nothing had changed. Shareholders, too, responded. At first with hesitation. Would this hurt the brand? Would truth dent profitability? But the data told another story. Productivity rose. Employee satisfaction jumped. The retention rate among new hires reached an all-time high. Public trust in Neon Apex, once teetering after the summit video dropped, was now surging. The message was clear. People didn't just want products, they wanted principles. And through it all, Shaq remained in the background. No tour, no celebration, no victory lap. He sat in meetings. He walked the halls. He read every monthly report from Zariah's program. His name appeared on very little, but his presence was in everything. Zariah, meanwhile, continued leading, not with perfection, but with clarity. She didn't use her story as a weapon or a shield. She used it as a map, a way to help others find the doors they thought were locked. She had become in many ways what Shaq once was, the quiet force shaping the future. And the world was still watching, but now it was learning too. The transformation didn't come with fireworks. There were no countdowns, no grand finales. Neon Apex moved forward not with a roar, but with a rhythm, a new cadence shaped by truth, discomfort, and redefinition. The building still stood tall in downtown Los Angeles, but something in the way people entered and exited had changed. They didn't rush. They didn't shrink. They looked up. Weeks had passed since the summit, but its echo hadn't faded. It lingered in every hallway conversation, in every applicant who stepped through the revolving glass doors, believing for the first time that maybe the game wasn't rigged against them. And at the heart of that echo was a girl who had once walked out of the same building with her head down, carrying silence like shame. Now Zariah Miles was writing. Not just memos or reports, not program blueprints or initiative briefings, but a book. Not to explain what happened, but to take ownership of it. Her words weren't bitter. They weren't soaked in revenge. They were steady, clear, and stitched with the kind of wisdom born from fire. The title came to her one morning, as she sat by the window of her new apartment, sunlight pouring over a legal pad covered in scribbles and edits. Unseen, not unworthy. The book wasn't about corporate takedowns. It was about the subtler wounds, the ones that don't leave bruises but live in boardroom glances, in hiring gut feelings, in the unspoken codes that reward familiarity and punish difference. She wrote about the moment she realized the man standing beside her wasn't just a mentor, but the mind behind the entire machine. She wrote about what it meant to reclaim her own story. And while the world watched her rise, Shaquille O'Neal stepped further back. Not in retreat, but in intention. He resumed his silent pace, attending meetings without fanfare, reviewing policies in solitude, mentoring from the shadows. He had never built this company for applause. He built it as a fortress against the noise, a shield for brilliance that the world too often overlooked. Now that shield was holding. He visited the new recruits, mostly in passing. A nod here, a quiet question there. They didn't always know who he was, and that was exactly how he wanted it. He had played the face long enough. Now it was time for others to lead. Zariah became the face of something bigger than herself, not a symbol, not a token, but a catalyst. People began to look at her and see possibility, not because she stood on a stage, but because she never asked permission to be in the room again. She brought chairs with her. Sometimes she brought hammers. The mentorship program expanded, branching into community colleges, underfunded tech schools, and even prisons. The message was simple: talent exists everywhere, access does not. Shaq funded it quietly. He never attached his name. And the company kept evolving. Slowly, honestly. The day the new entryway was unveiled, the entire staff gathered in the main lobby. It wasn't a required event. People came because they wanted to see what had changed. Above the security gates, carved into a black slate wall now stripped of corporate gloss, were the words, "They rejected me because of my skin. I built the empire they were too blind to see." No attribution, no plaque. But everyone knew whose truth it was. It wasn't just Shaq's voice etched into that stone. It was Zariah's. It was every intern turned away, every resume deleted too soon, every "you're not the right fit" that masked fear of difference. It was a confession and a declaration, a reminder that some revolutions don't explode, they unfold. Zariah stood at the edge of the crowd, eyes tracing the words slowly. Not with pride, but with understanding. The quote didn't exist to celebrate pain. It existed to honor survival and the power of refusal. Refusal to disappear. Refusal to soften. Refusal to let silence be the final word. Behind her, Shaq watched. He didn't step forward. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She turned just slightly, catching his eyes across the room. No nod, No signal. Just a moment shared. One generation handing the story to the next, knowing it would be told differently, but carried with the same weight. Later that evening, Zariah returned to her desk, flipping through the draft of her manuscript. She paused on the dedication page, then picked up her pen. To those who tried to erase us, we are still here. And now we own the ink. She wrote it not in anger, but in truth. Because that was the final victory. Not the corner office, not the media cycle, not even the name on the program. It was the power to narrate, to define the legacy not in spite of their skin, but because of it. And for the first time, no one could take that away. If this story made you pause, it wasn't fiction doing the work, it was truth finding a voice. Look around your boardrooms, your classrooms, your silence. The systems don't shift until someone inside them does. The next Zariah shouldn't need a disguise to be seen. You're not just watching the change, you're standing in its way or walking with it. Decide,